Kelly and Murray is asking, this question is for Dr. King. How do you propose to we move towards an appropriate framework to effect the necessary growth enhancement strategies?
You see, the problem with that is that the question alludes to, and my own opening remarks really spoke to issues outside of the sphere of economic thinking. It really spoke to not, as I said, we know what the growth enhancement strategies are, the growth enhancement economic strategies. What we really need to spend time thinking about, and what the question is alluding to, is what are the growth inhibiting political problems. Now, I'm not really sort of competent to deal with that issue, but that's what it speaks to. But that really is a critical issue. And I give you two examples, or I give you one example twice. I mentioned in the opening remarks that all of the entries in the public debate speak to the issue of the exemptions and exceptions to our tax code, including the GCT system, where there are a large number of zero-rated and exempt items in the GCT. All the proposals speak to reducing dramatically the number of exemptions and exceptions. On two occasions in the last 3 years, government, the current administration actually attempted to do so, announced a reduction in the number of zero-rated and exempt items, and within a week and a half, on both occasions, they reversed themselves, reinstituted back the exemptions and exceptions, and turned in a different direction. Question we need to, and those proposals are still out there, and that is still a good thing to do, because it's going to make the tax code simpler. It's going to close a huge loophole for tax evasion, and it is therefore going to bring in revenue, which is going to balance the budget, and balancing the budget, help to balance the budget. And balancing the budget means the government is borrowing less, interest rates are going to come down, it's going to promote growth. But that strategy, that policy, which has a consensus, which has a clear path to economic growth, which the government attempted twice, has not been pursued. We need to understand what is the problem.
Thank you, Damien. A related question, which I will throw to Milton and Vitus, from Lieber Brown. Don't you think that our government is more inhibitor than facilitator to economic growth?
That has been nicely put. Vitus knows that in other councils I have not put it quite that diplomatically. So the short answer is yes, I agree. But I think, funnily enough, it is tied in part to Damien's interpretation and answer to the penultimate question. There are political and other considerations which too often prevent government from taking the steps and the measures which ought to be taken. And that is why the fundamental feature of the growth agenda is measuring every policy, every strategy against its ability to enhance economic growth. And if the policy and strategy does not do that, it must not get the support of the private sector, and it ought not to get the support of well-thinking Jamaicans. And people ought to be as, the cry in that area needs to be as loud as the cry of needs for justice.
Thank you.
Again, it is a point that's known. I mean, it's said over and over, the government should really be facilitators and allow the private sector to be the ones who generate growth. I mean, that is said by the government, is there. But we come back to the actual point of implementation, of actually seeing that taking place, because we still see that in a number of areas that the government is still active in terms of participating within the economy, on areas that the private sector should be involved in. I mean, we're not saying that there is a role, as I said, to facilitate, but certainly they must understand that they need to actually create the right environment, create the right circumstances, and leave it to the private sector to actually generate the growth that's required.
All right, thank you. All right, move to another question from Lieber Brown. Mr. Bowen, a lot of us have huge business ideas, but don't have the capital to back them and make them work. Is your bank prepared to assist those of us with these huge ideas with venture capital?
Venture capital. In my view, banks are not the right entities to be doing venture capital. Again, the role of a bank is to take, deposit, and lend other people's money to companies and earn sufficient spread that it accommodates the loss ratio and the cost of delivery. I will agree that there is a need for venture capital. And I think that as a country we've got to look at how we facilitate that. I don't think the banking sector is the right place for it. What I think would facilitate it is, again, continued enhancement of the non-lending options that are out there through looking at fund legislation and the ability to attract pools of funds, pools of savings that are prepared to take that higher risk. But in return for that higher risk, they've got to expect a higher return. But the banking sector, I don't think pure venture capital is the right place for them.
All right, thank you. I just want to make a comment before I move on to the further questions. And I want to refer to a Brookings Institute paper by Peter Blair and Conrad Miller, it's a 2009 paper. And I quote the authors here, where they said, differences in macroeconomic policy choices, not differences in institutions, account for the heterogeneous growth experiences of these two Caribbean nations. We're talking about Barbados and Jamaica. So essentially these authors looked at the growth experience of Barbados and Jamaica and have arrived at the conclusion that it's a difference in mindset, difference in policies that were pursued that have led to the different economic outcome of the two countries. And within that context, it speaks to some of what Damien spoke to as it relates to implementation problem and some of the governance issues which one of our listeners alluded to as it relates to whether or not government is an inhibitor to economic growth. And I just want to put it to the panelists as to what is it that we can do from a governance or an institutional reform framework to improve the implementation of policies, well, A, the conceptualization of policies, and then B, implementation of policies. Let's start with David.
The issue of economic governance is actually of fundamental importance. Economic governance is one step back from economic policy because it determines the framework and the rules within which you actually discuss and conduct and enact your economic policies. And at the start of the discussion, we mentioned a number of areas, and I will repeat them quickly. One is to have a fiscal policy framework, because it is clear that as much as we like to think that government always acts in the public interest, the fact is the government is being administered by a political party, and the political party of necessity has to think about the interest of the party. It has to be re-elected for one thing. So the incentives of the party that is administering the government clearly are not going to align perfectly with the public interest. That is something that we can lament and wring your hands about, but it's a fact of life in every country. And for that reason, a lot of countries have fiscal responsibility frameworks that parameterize and constrain what governments can do with their budgets and what they can't do. So that is one area of economic governance that is important. Having a central treasury management system, which this administration, which Minister Shaw actually spoke about in his first budget presentation as Minister of Finance, and the importance of it, and setting as a goal that we're going to move in that direction. Central treasury management system gives the Ministry of Finance access to information on and control of the treasuries of all public entities, whether in central government or not. And so they can manage cash in a much more efficient way, which is an important thing to do when you're trying to manage so much debt. Consolidated budgets is an important area. Caribbean Policy Research Institute did an analysis of the growth of our debt and discovered in that analysis that the entire increase in Jamaica's debt stock from the low point in 1996 of 71% of GDP and the high point in 2003 of 143% of GDP, that entire increase in the debt stock came about not because the government was running primary deficits, which is to say, not because the government was spending more on housekeeping expenses than they were earning in tax revenue. All of the growth of the debt came about because of liabilities outside of central government that the government ended up taking on board and taking fiscal responsibility for. FinSac, Air Jamaica, National Water Commission, sugar industry, all of the debt. So if we reduce the debt and that risk of central government liabilities remains, then we're going to find ourselves just as indebted again in short order. So another economic governance area is to ensure that those off-central government liabilities are managed very well. So the government has to start publishing consolidated budgets so that those risks in the public enterprises are aware of ahead of time and can be managed better. A huge opportunity exists in a very simple exercise where since the Minister of Finance has at his discretion the ability to waive any tax obligation and therefore impose a tax expenditure on the public, on ourselves, then that is a public act and it should be published. Every time the minister waives a tax obligation for a private citizen, that information should be published so that the public knows that this benefit is being given, and if they want to ask questions, they can ask questions. No, it is not only not published, it is near impossible to get the information, even though this is actions that are being taken in the public interest. And we mentioned before, and will not repeat, the importance of a monetary policy framework. These are areas where economic governance can be improved in such a way that you end up making better policy without specifying what those better policies are going to be.
Thank you. Do you have any comments regarding economic governance? What is it that we could do to improve policy implementation?
I echo what was said. I think that getting that consolidated budget is the one that's always struck me, because I've seen over the years exactly to the point, I didn't know the research that all the increase was due to that, but I've seen that FinSec debt, the Air Jamaica debt, all this other debt come on to the government's books and balloon the debt. And it's the other fiscal responsibility legislation, the debt management legislation, the central treasury are all integral parts of the policy framework that with the IMF, the World Bank, and others that we put out there. And to your point, they need to be implemented. I know that most, if not all of them, are in train, but it's getting through the process.